So readiness planning, I'll talk a bit about that. I think it's more of a journey more than anything. It's not really a task that we can tick off as being complete, and today really forms a key part of that journey. So it's great to have Acelino, Samuel and other experts in the room, and certainly we'll be picking their brains later this afternoon to try and learn as much as we can and maximise this opportunity. So for the purposes of this talk, I've divided readiness planning into three components. In reality, they're all pretty intertwined. But firstly, what we're doing in partnership with MPI to reduce the likelihood and impact of an incursion of ceratocystis, how we're advancing our tools and knowledge through R&D, and I don't want to forget also the industry awareness and on-orchard best practice. I think one of the key lessons of our readiness planning is that if there is a window for eradication, as Simon alluded to earlier, we must detect it early and in that contained space. So having practices to make sure it hasn't spread before we know it's here is really critical. So Sophie earlier talked about GIA and how we have these operational agreements within that, and ceratocystis is one of our sector risk organisms. So what this means is we've agreed how we're going to share costs in a response and for our preparedness activity as well. One of the first things we did was to create a readiness plan in partnership with MPI, and this is really to say, what do we need to do to prepare? How would we keep it out? How do we prevent the spread? You know, what do those on-orchard practices look like? And how would we respond? So we drafted this up, and then at one of our KiwiNet workshops, we tested this with industry to make sure what the scientists were thinking, was going to work when we test this with the kiwifruit industry. So that's a bit of the overview, and that was a simulation that we ran there. So keeping it out, so Acelino mentioned earlier that we are obviously concerned about the kiwifruit strain in Brazil, but there are other strains around the world as well that also need to be on our radar. And he talked about the strains in Oman, Pakistan, South China and Indonesia as well. So we're making sure that these are on our radar, as well as some other strains in South America as well. So we have flagged this with MPI and are making sure measures are in place. We're also, this rapid Ohia death, this was formerly a ceratocystis fimbriata, as was mentioned by Murde, and now has been reclassified as a different species. But that we're still very interested to know whether that species could be pathogenic to kiwifruit. Hawaii is close physically, but we're also very connected. A lot of people go to Hawaii on holiday, so we are going to do some screening on that strain to see if it is pathogenic to kiwifruit. And of course, you can see there that Ohia tree is very similar looking and closely related to our own Pahutakawa. So there's also work going on there to see the susceptibility of Pahutakawa as well, outside of this group, obviously. So the most likely pathways of getting here, infected plant material is always a high-risk pathway for any plant pathogen. These are managed through import health standards. When we first learned what was going on in Brazil, we flagged this with MPI's emerging risk system off the back of Elaine and Joy's visit, and they responded by adding measures for ceratocystis across all the nursery stock import pathways. So there are measures in place, and when the actinidia pathway reopened, it was closed following PSA and it has reopened for tissue culture plants. Ceratocystis is one of the key organisms of focus to make sure measures are robust and in place. Soil contamination on footwear or machinery is pretty high risk, and I think MPI have a couple measures, a couple teams in place, if you like, or systems to make sure they're keeping up with risk. And there's that emerging risk system I talked about, but there's also an intelligence team, and we have Kinhua here with us today, who is a member of the MPI intelligence team. She's working on Ceratocystis specifically. And they did a bit of a review on what the most likely pathway would be of entry into New Zealand, how it might get here. And given that some of the other pathways are quite well managed, the highest risk pathway was considered to be on footwear of someone who's possibly walked or worked in a kiwifruit orchard in Brazil, or as we've heard from Assalino, other areas as well where it's endemic in the soil. So the high risk pathway would be someone gets this level of inoculum, like that footwear there, travels through, not picked up at the border, and comes through onto a kiwifruit orchard. So I guess my challenge for you is, if that person happens to turn up on your orchard, how effective are your on-orchard biosecurity practices to manage that risk? So advancing tools and knowledge, some of this has been covered today, so I'll flick through it quite quickly. But we had this literature review initially. We've had people go over to Brazil, working with Assalino and others. We are screening these cultivars, has been highlighted, and also having these tools in place to make sure we can detect the pathogen. And it was interesting to hear that initial confusion in Brazil between Phytophthora and Ceratocystis when it first expressed itself. So that's something we need to be very aware of as well, both reporting the unusual, what you're seeing on your orchard, but also having these diagnostic tools to differentiate. So knowledge gaps, we've still got plenty of knowledge gaps, and we'll be working through these, some of these this afternoon, and hopefully advancing our preparedness there, what we know about it, how we best sample, and of course how we best eradicate and contain the pathogen if it was to get here. So industry best practice, Assalino mentioned that the pathogen doesn't spread very far on its own. It will spread short distances, but it really relies on humans for this long distance spread. So having, we've got kind of in red there, plant propagative material, that's the high risk pathway, and our kiwifruit plant certification scheme is a scheme to reduce the risk of spreading new pathogens like Ceratocystis as well as PSA across the industry. And of course our on-orchard guidelines. These aren't just about PSA, we're thinking about what best practice might look like. And this is really around those key practices that Simon mentioned earlier. Understanding what the risks are and what's appropriate on your orchard to manage those risks. So we often get challenged, what's the value in a footbath? And maybe for PSA, not much, but maybe for someone coming in from offshore or another part of New Zealand with dirty footwear on a soil-borne pathogen, it could be hugely important. So that's all from me. Thanks a lot.